So for those people who are listening, this was planned about, let me look, 14 minutes ago. Okay, so this is fairly impromptu. We have done no preparation for this. And I wanted to have a chat with Cass because of this sort of recent debate and all the stuff that has come along with it. And the reason I wanted to do it, also, because I have been told you this, so you're hearing this for the first time as well, is just because I feel like, despite the fact that you will make, as you already have, practical application extracted from the debate, hey, here's my practical recommendations for training the lower lats versus the upper lats based on my rationale. I think many people are still taking the wrong conclusions away from the conversation. And I wanted to just provide some insight, if I can call it that, that I had on the debate that I just haven't seen a lot of conversation about. Mostly, by the way, just basing this take off of the comments, which is really all that we have to assess what people's reactions were. And obviously, your fans, if we'll call them that, are going to react a bit differently emotionally, naturally, as hers are going to act in an opposite direction. Does that kind of sound good to you?
Yeah.
Do you have anything you wanted to just to add to that as a preface or no?
No, we can roll with that.
Okay, cool. So the way that I wanted to go about this was in two, because I think there are really two very, very helpful things to extract from this conversation, or these two conversations, you can call them that. Because it's not really a debate. It's not really a conversation. It's something else. It's something else that cannot be categorized. The first is like the practical, like muscle-based stuff, which I just want to clear up and clarify for people who are still maybe confused about any of that. And then the second part of it, which I actually think is the more important thing to extract from the conversation, is just kind of a lesson in understanding science and science communication, and also just kind of like tips and things to sort of look for when you're listening to two people talk about a subject. I think that just principally that will be helpful for people.
Mhm.
So first things first, I think if anyone listens to the first debate and watches the first debate specifically, and they go through, or they basically just watch the part about, basically where you explain lab mechanics, your rationale, all the moment arm stuff, and your sort of reasoning behind that, where you give even exercise examples as well. I think that's the part of the first debate that is valuable just in terms of this part of the conversation. So just starting from there, I think what people should do is watch that first if they're interested just in the mechanic stuff. And if they're still confused about it, the way that I would think about just lats, overall lat training, is basically as follows. Number one, practically speaking, we can subdivide lats into two portions. There's the one that is higher up and more horizontal. There's the one that is lower down and more vertical. And to simplify exercise selection for those two different portions, again, broadly speaking, we can do some kind of horizontal-ish thing for the upper portion. The way I like to teach that to people is just like, hey, these things, they look like they're more this way, right? More horizontal. So like practically I do a more horizontal thing. And then alternatively for the lower lats, the things that look more vertical, we're just going to do something that is more vertical. And that's the most practical version of the takeaway. But on a more specific, a more precise level, the rationale behind that is effectively that the lats are quite similar in terms of the upper and lower portions from the perspective of the shoulder joint, what we call the shoulder joint, the glenohumeral joint, but from the perspective of how the lats act on the entire shoulder girdle. In other words, the upper arm, the clavicle, and the shoulder blade all together. That's kind of where the differentiation occurs. So everything I've laid out so far, would you agree with that? Anything to sort of add?
Yeah, I think if we're going for the lowest common denominator practical look, that's yes.
Okay, awesome. If you were to take that a step further and say, okay, where can we sort of add just a little bit more nuance to that? What would be the sort of next layer of the cake of nuance there while still keeping it at a level of practical application?
Well, I think in addition to choosing exercises that move in two different planes, is making sure that you're actually taking advantage of those two different planes. So that means that when we're doing a horizontal thing, that we're actually getting protraction and retraction. And should be we'll say coordinated motion that's gradual throughout. Like I know sometimes people are taught to isolate one and then do the other. The only application I like of that is like if we're doing like some partials at the end. But I think the next thing to emphasize is that, hey, if you're going to split up your training into vertical and horizontal pulling, make sure you actually capitalize on the different range of motion. So when you're doing pull downs, do things that really allow you to get full elevation of the shoulder, and then make sure your intention is not to pull back, but it's actually to reverse that and to drive the arm down. And then the same thing in rows, make sure you're trying to get that full stretch forward, and then make sure your intention is to pull back towards retraction. Because I think sometimes people just mix match the intentions or the cues. So they'll be trying to drive their elbow down on a row, which can lead to, oh, I feel my lower lats when I'm doing this, but we're mismatching like posing the lower lats with doing a upper lat exercise. And so don't get confused by the fact that, yes, you can make it so you feel your lower lats in a row by just intentionally trying to squeeze down on them, but you should save that intent for your vertical pulls.
Yeah, makes sense. And just as maybe an additional bit of context to the vertical motions, interested to see what your take on this is. But in my experience and what I observe, practically speaking, it seems to me that much of the elevation, depression, sort of for those people who are watching, like if you do like like a shrug up with your arms like this, and then, a reverse shrug, if you want to call it that, much of that range of motion, like much of the length change that comes from that portion of a pull down seems to occur in like the top, 50, 60%, where a lot of times, obviously depends on where the load is, but a lot of times the kind of thing you'll see is people's arms, they come up here, they kind of are doing the extensions, so they're driving their arm down as their shoulder girdle is coming down. And then this last little bit down here seems to be mostly just an extension driven thing. So would it be a good practical takeaway to say a way to make sure that you're sort of checking that box of training depression is to make sure that you're doing something that emphasizes specifically the top portion of a pull down?
Yes, and that should be the natural kind of scapulohumeral rhythm, right? So
Yeah.
hopefully, if you're just focusing on getting the full stretch and then reversing it, you don't have to put a lot of thought into accomplishing that, because the top portion, like scapulohumeral rhythm, is not like some people like, oh, it's 1 degree for every 2. No, it's not this like linear thing. So
Mhm.
it's the majority glenohumeral movement, then it's a mix. And then as we get to the top, it's actually more scapular and scapulothoracic motion that's happening up there. So as long as you get the stretch, you have to reverse out of it the same way, unless you do something weird where you like keep your shoulders up
Yeah.
and pull down. And I think that's just the mistake people make, where they're thinking too much about pulling the bar rather than driving their humerus down. So I think
Mhm.
as long as you're thinking about driving your arm down, hopefully this should be intuitive and it shouldn't take a lot of thought. But if you are trying to improve the skill, this is where you could look at lengthened partials as a way of actually just practicing how you manage that top movement. The mistake I think I see most is that sometimes people will turn it into literally a reverse shrug, where they pull back and down instead of pulling their humerus down. So if you're working on that skill, it should look like that your humerus doesn't flip back and then go down to a point where like you'd almost feel like they're pinching together. It should
Mhm.
feel like you stay in a similar protraction, and then the whole shoulder girdle kind of goes down, but like towards your love handle iliac crest area, not towards your middle spine.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. For those people maybe who were a little unclear in terms of like that aspect of it, the way that I would think about it is kind of more like you're just aiming to sort of drive your armpit almost down to your pocket rather than sort of
Mhm.
pulling back like you would in an upper, like a sort of wide row pull down kind of a thing.
Mhm. But adult pockets, not like the pockets that are like halfway down your
Yes.
thigh kind of thing,
Yes.
right?
Adult pockets. Listen, that may be the most controversial part of this discussion, so I will leave that there and people can comment on that in the comments. Anyway, so the one other thing I wanted to say in relation to this is just kind of like, I don't know, I feel like this relates sort of thematically to the direction that things have taken online with the whole science versus bro stuff, which I think is largely, I don't know, I think it's a largely over exaggerated thing in the sense that I don't, when I see people in person, people who are quote science based, I don't really see the kinds of things that the sort of bros are describing in relation to zero effort, zero load. I mean, I see it from time to time. You get your overthinking students, those kinds of things, but I don't see it a lot. But what I will say is that and I'll give a different example of this because I think it'll maybe ring true for you, is a lot of people now are, say, listening to science communicators who are extrapolating mobile arm data. We see this with the left for sure. Maybe extrapolating is the wrong word, but misrepresenting could be another word. And they're basically taking whatever a quote science communicator says at face value, and then they're applying it to their training. So an example that I've seen a lot in relation to this recently is stuff related to the upper chest, the upper pecs, where people are talking about the role of the upper pec as a shoulder flexor. Right. And when people hear shoulder flexion, what they, you do a quick Google search. Okay. What does the upper pec do? Okay. Primarily it's a shoulder flexor. What is shoulder flexion? It's just like raising the arm forward. Right. So now you're getting people doing exercises where they're basically doing like front raises, and they're saying like, this is the best way to train the upper pec. Adduction, if you're doing a chest fly, that's not the thing to do, right? So by the time you've gotten to that point, okay, it's not too late, it's not too late for you. But what I do want to make a point of here is, it seems like people are they're almost like denying their experience of an exercise, and they're almost like putting the priority or they're putting aside the paying attention to the experience of an exercise in favor of listening to XYZ science communicator who has apparently done all the work for them. And so what I've noticed over time is people they just seem to pay less and less attention to like, oh, what do I think about this experience of this exercise? Like, where do I actually sense fatigue? What does it feel like is the rate limiter of this motion? And I know that there are multiple variables that can contribute to that, but the lats are another good example of this, right? Where it's like, okay, imagine that you just hung from a pull-up bar and just had someone, just like yank your feet down. You put a dip belt on. Imagine if you just hung from a pull-up bar or you put a ton of load on like a pull down station, and you just held your arms like in front of you at maybe a slightly forward angle, right? It's like assuming that nothing else were to give out. It's like it's just a denial of the experience of the kinds of things that you're feeling when you're going through those motions. And to me, it's also, for any people who are maybe coaches out there, it's one of the things that is most helpful to me trying to get people to understand like how to bias their lats is coaching them through what you said earlier, this intent to kind of move the shoulder girdle rather than the upper arm. So there are all these like little things across all these examples where it's like people have these firm conclusions that they've extrapolated from things that are either extrapolated or misrepresented. And then they've just have paid no attention to, hey, what have I experienced in the past? Does it really feel like you're doing a pec deck and you're not fatigued in your upper chest? Is that really ever the experience that anyone has? It's hard to believe that's the case. And I'm willing to admit that there are maybe certain cases where people are doing just all sorts of weird things, or maybe just where they have no interest in learning about any of this stuff. So they're just sort of taking in whatever they can. But I don't know if you have any commentary on that, but I just wanted to make a point that like overall with the lat related stuff, even if anyone watched all of your, explanation about it, all of your practical takeaways, and they were like, man, I just don't agree with this whole moment arm thing. It's just wrong. It's wrong math, but I can't do the math. But your math is still wrong kind of a thing. It just feels like a denial of the experience of what do you experience in training? If you're doing this reverse rud thing, what do you feel? So I'll stop rambling there, but if you have any thoughts on that, I'm super interested.
Well, the first thing I think you need to consider is the population that is taking this approach, and it is the people that have the least amount of experience in training. So basically the least amount of experience on how things working, how they feel, etc. And they haven't really developed that skill of being in tune to your body. When you see people that don't have that much training experience, their ability in terms of motor control, sensation, and stuff like that, and basically at that point in time, novelty is probably the biggest source of fatigue for them, because everything is a new range of motion at that point in time when they start something different. So I think when you have the least amount of experience to go on, there's the largest temptation to want to just get that information externally, right? To just trust the thing, because you don't have a lot of trust in your own personal experience yet. And I was actually talking about this on a podcast just last week, where we're comparing people that trained in the 80s, et cetera, or the bodybuilders from 40 years ago, et cetera, versus people now and their different levels of education. And right now, there's an abundance of information out there, and it's very easy to forego the learning process and the skill development process that people had to go through before there was this abundance of information. Back then, the gym was like, hey, we know a few things, but try this stuff and see how it works, right? So you
Yeah.
basically you had to really focus on how things were affecting you, right? And you just had to be in tune with your body, and you had to take note of those things. Now it seems like most people, they want to get ahead, so they're essentially skipping the skill building part of lifting and going immediately to external validation for the things they do. And you layer that on top of insecurity of nobody wants to be wrong. And so then there's a resistance to change and trying other things. So I
Mhm.
think there's just kind of like this mess of variables that's putting people onto a path where they're really missing out on an important part of training, which is actually the skill of being kind of body aware and in tune with kind of how you respond to exercises. And then that's not perfect. We still need the evidence-based stuff too, because sometimes sensations and stuff can be misleading, but you definitely don't want to forego that for only external evidence on why you're doing what you're doing in the gym.
Mhm. Yeah, so that makes sense to me. I have a little bit of pushback on the point. I think the point, I totally take the point about, just the concept of the less experience and understanding that you have, the more you're willing to sort of take things at face value because your educational filter, your experiential filters is quite underdeveloped. But I do think that many of the people, say, who like follow Scientific Snitch, or just like anyone who ends up in this weird niche of Instagram, YouTube, they probably have some degree of deeper interest in the subject, to the point where I really doubt that someone who just started training yesterday, or someone who has no, awareness of their body, would be listening to a debate between you and Ella, or we'll call her the Snitch. So it's like, I do take the point, but I also see and experience just through, the students, people who I'm communicating with on a regular basis, that like a lot of the people, at least that I'm exposed to, have at least like a baseline understanding of what they're feeling and maybe what they're supposed to be feeling and like where they're supposed to be feeling it. So I do worry that that specific population is sort of falling in almost like in a backward direction, if that makes sense,
Mhm.
rather than someone sort of tumbling forward at least through some information, and then maybe they're paying attention to the experience. It's like people are having these experiences, and then they're hearing this information, and then they're almost gaslighting their own experiences based on the information, that if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, with anything, if we generalize it, then there's going to be subgroups that you could make. And one of those subgroups is going to be the people that have heightened curiosity. And so they're going to be more interested in listening to these things and pursuing nuances and wanting to learn these things. And then you're also going to have a subgroup of people that just really don't like uncertainty. And so they just want somebody that's just going to give them an answer. It's more important that they have an answer than whether or not they really know that is the correct answer. So you're going to have these different kind of subgroups and they're each going to utilize this information a little bit differently. But once you get into a circle or a group, there can be a mentality that kind of spreads across those subgroups. So you could have gone in with, hey, I just want to listen to this person because I'm interested in science and nuances. And before you know it, you're like in a cult.
Yeah, I guess that's typically the way that it goes. Is you kind of don't know where you're at until you're like, oh shit, that's here I am,
Mhm.
been there, done that, as you know. Okay, anything else like specific lat stuff before we move on to the other stuff? I mean, there will be some overlap, but anything else that you wanted to maybe just revisit or reiterate as conclusions on that section, or no?
I mean, not really. I just put up a post like yesterday, I think, on like really point by point, the practical applications. If you want to like crawl down the nuances of how to increase the degree of which we can bias these things, then yeah, we can talk about unilateral and trunk positions and all of those things. So go look at that. But I don't know how far down you want to go on that here.
Okay. I think that it would be good to maybe just say briefly that the different portions of the lats are affected differently by trunk position. I mean, you could say spine position. That's also, I think, fine. Spine and hip position. Would it be fair to conclude that the lower portions, specifically the ones that attach to the hip, those ones would be more affected by spine position? So we'll say the lower half. So the ones that attach, through the lumbar spine, the ones that attach on the hip, those will be affected by different trunk motions, whereas the upper portions, I believe you said, are less so affected. And that's because the actual thoracic spine segments are kind of rotating with the arm position. Do I have that right?
Now, it's not that the upper has zero benefit. At least when we look at the shear data, where basically they're actually looking at a individual sarcomere and see how much it gets stretched, we see a greater magnitude of stretch with trunk stuff in the upper lats than we do in modeling, because in modeling, like, the muscle is actually literally broken up. Whereas when we're looking at a real person, the tissue can only separate so much. But for sure, there's a huge difference in the amount of length change in the lower portion of the lats that you get. Now, the only exclusion there, if we're like just talking about where these are, is those costal fibers that are attached to the rib. Okay, they're obviously not going to get as much length leaning from the pelvis, but again, the muscle is there. So I think the simplest version of it is the lower portion of your lat gets a significant increase in range of motion and muscle length if you lateral bend away from it or side bend away from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for people who are maybe confused by that visual, you can hopefully just look at me. Tell me if my audio is too bad. It would be like, okay, so if I want to stretch this right lat, right, I'm here, and then I'm this way. So I'm kind of opening the ribs on the same side and I'm almost crunching the other side. Right. And the one thing that I will say, just in terms of my experience seeing people do this, is a lot of people, they'll do the version where they're like kind of face sideways on a pull down. And then what they'll do, so they'll set up well. And then a lot of times they just sort of lean back over, they get pulled by the cable. So not that I think this is like the hugest deal ever, but I do think it's important to, at least when you're trying to sort of figure it out for the first time, that you do have a good sense of like where your abs are, which abs are on, which abs are off. I've actually used like people doing crunches as a way to start to like actually feel that. Do you have any sort of tips on finding that position, feeling that position, just broadly speaking, in terms of mistakes you've seen?
So one of the things that we found really helpful for the both positioning and the technique is to, if you have access to it, is to sit on a wedge. So basically you can get the pelvis at an angle. Now, obviously it can't be so much of an angle that you're like falling off the seat, but if you have a bench where the seat part adjusts or whatever, you can use that. Or if you can take a wedge and put it on the pull down machine, etc. So that basically you're sitting in an angle that's essentially going to open that side of the pelvis. What it does is it decreases how much you need to lean. And we tend to have better proprioception when we're straight up and down, and not as good when we start like getting into weird angles and then not knowing which way's up and down and back and forth. If you can do something where you can pre-stretch at the pelvis, that helps a lot for a variety of ways. And then also, if you have something that you can brace in, whether you can use the roller pad of the pull down or put a medicine ball there, or if you set up an incline bench so that you can stick a forearm or something. Because essentially what you want to do is you want that once you get into that torso position, you'd want to just be able to hang out there, even if you let go of the handle, right? So if you can find something that makes you that stable, and then essentially the resistance should basically be pulling you into that. I think sometimes people are trying to reach over further than where the pulley is above them. Then they're leaning, but their arm's not actually, coming across. So don't try and make an exercise do more than what it's capable of. So just whatever lateral bend is feasible in the setup you have, just go with that. It's better to maybe shorten the range of motion a little bit and have a good technique and keep the tension where you want it than it is to be like, oh, look at all the stretch I got, but the cable was like totally misaligned with what I was trying to do.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to create a visual for people. Joint Structure and Function, everyone. Great book. A fantastic book, just so you know. So what Cass is basically saying is if you had a wedge, if I were trying to stretch this right side, you would want to wedge like this, right? So your pelvis would basically be tipped in this direction. So you're closed off. This is an extreme here, but that's kind of what you're pointing to, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. So this, my left ass cheek is higher, my right ass cheek is lower. This side opens up. And then the second thing that you were saying, assuming this stays here, is basically like, okay, if you're coming up and over this way, you maybe can push into something here. We don't want to allow this to bend and start to basically just zero everything out, right? So that we're not being pulled across. So wedge here, higher up one ass cheek, pull across that.
Yep.
It's like a little cute dance move.
Mhm. I'll even like on some machines, what I'll do is I'll literally take my one cheek and slide it all the way off and let the weight of that leg pull that side down.
Yeah,
You
I
do
like that.
get a bit of a spreading effect, so just keep that in mind.
Yeah.
right?
Careful who's around. Careful who's
Yeah.
around.
And just, clean up after yourself. That's all I'm saying.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. So the second part of this conversation is just as I mentioned in science communication. And I was, so let me take a step back. I was surprised at the amount of comments. Maybe I shouldn't have been surprised by this. That went something like the following, I just don't understand the point of this. This is just a waste of time. Sort of anything that was along those lines. I don't know how you feel personally about how your time was spent. We can talk about that maybe after this. But I think when people make those kinds of comments, I don't know why, we're having these discussions. Who is this helping? This is no longer useful. I think they're just not seeing the use clearly enough of it. And what I mean more specifically is when you're listening to two people who are talking about a subject, one that is, let's say, not hopefully opinion based, not just something that's supposed to be super emotional or philosophical or non-specific, right? Something empirical, something science rooted. I think it's really important, number one, to pay very close attention to how specifically topics are being addressed. So a lot of times what will happen in these sorts of debates is things will start at a level of specificity. A claim will be made, a counter argument will be made. Perhaps it'll go back and forth. It'll ping pong for a little. But at some point, a goalpost will shift. At some point, there will be a more generalizable claim. At some point, the same claim will start to be repeated over and over. And when you notice those types of things, basically what is being revealed to you as the listener is, okay, this is where this person's argument ends. And when the person starts to kind of like double down, triple down, quadruple down on the same point repeatedly, that to me is like a sign of, okay, it's not that like that person's side of the debate or argument should be ignored. It's more just, okay, I'm listening to two people, one of which who has taken the argument from point A to point B, the other of which has taken the argument from point A to point D or much further, right? You get the analogy that I'm trying to draw there. And so it is important, I think, to be able to make those distinctions in communication, because when you're just listening to someone on, say, social media, where it's just their content and they are presenting maybe a counter argument to someone else, it's very difficult to discern, like, okay, where are these claims coming from? I'm sure it took you a very long time to sort of trace down every little, misrepresentation of information or miscommunication or misspeak, right, that was made in prior posts, et cetera. So it takes a lot more work. And this, I'm just speaking for people listening. It takes a lot more work to clean things up than it does to just set 20 different fires. You can set like 20 different fires in the span of 15 seconds, right? And it's in the context of that debate, there's no possible way to address every little fire. So what you have to kind of focus on is the degree of specificity of claims being made, and then also the consistency of claims being made throughout the course of a debate, which is a little bit more difficult to pay attention to, especially if you, as you know, are someone who's actually in the act of going back and forth with someone. It's like impossible in real time, especially when, maybe emotions are high and things about personal character being said, whatever, you're being attacked, et cetera. So I will stop that portion of what I wanted to say there. Do you have any response or thoughts on that more generally, or maybe just a more concise version of that, a clearer takeaway?
I would say I'm not surprised by the number of those comments, just by the way the debate went. To be honest, and you and I have discussed this before, is listening to a debate is not necessarily the best way to try and learn from either person or to get the information. Hopefully, if you're listening to a debate on a topic, hopefully you are somewhat informed enough that you can audit the conversation a little bit. Otherwise, I think that the reason that so much, we'll say, bad debate happens is you're just banking on the audience being uninformed, and therefore you can say things, say whatever you want. And that's not just uninformed from a knowledge perspective, but also just like they don't understand if somebody said something one way or another, like people have no knowledge of history of what's led up to it as well, right? Given this current one and kind of the way it went, yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all, especially because there were so many things about here's some research and this is what was misrepresented and so many studies to get through and things like that, that if you're just waiting for the answer, there's so much going back and forth on all these little details. And really what you just want to know, you just want there to be this hard conclusion at the end that lets you know what to do. And that's not usually going to happen. If you have two people that are very objective, you can actually gain a lot. And also the debaters can gain a lot through that process. If one or both parties is not super objective in their intent, then what you'll have is a very messy conversation that is very hard to follow. And it won't be point to point. It'll be like running off on all these tangents and whataboutisms, et cetera, and stuff like that. And even I got drawn into that in the last part, like the part 2, the last 10 minutes of this was just, it's just kind of embarrassing. But to be honest, I was just frustrated with the fact that I knew that there was no useful communication that was going to happen. And sometimes that just happens when you have two people that are trying to have a conversation about a topic and they're just very, very far apart on their understanding. And it's very hard to not get defensive in that type of context, right? And it's also very hard not to get frustrated and lose your track of thought when you're trying to convey a point, but you can't ever get to that point because you're constantly having to address things that are misrepresentative or mischaracterized, et cetera. And I'm like, why do I have to constantly go back and just be like, hey, that's not what I said. I would like to continue the conversation forward, but I have to keep correcting the conversation that we've had up to this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to follow that up with one question, but before I do, I just want to give it because I thought of an example of just, again, for those, it would be hard to imagine that someone would be watching this conversation without having seen at least any of the other two. So, but just for those of people who haven't, there was one point in the debate that I want to point to insofar as specifics are concerned, because I think it's a good example. I said earlier that it's important that people in their responses and in their arguments can be specific. And what I mean by that is just on a simple level, like, can they give examples of what they're describing? Can they give one example or can they give multiple? For instance, like, is the limit of their knowledge this fact that they memorized, or is it principle dependent so that they can extrapolate it across context, those sorts of things. But also just like consistency across a discussion, which again, as I mentioned, is difficult to do, even if you're in the discussion, just because it's like so many different things are being said, like you mentioned, but also just consistency in terms of claims that are within different contexts, but that represent the same principle. So let me give a specific example. So one of the claims that was made, like early on, I don't remember at this point which of the debates it was she basically said something like, the lats have an insignificant amount of force imposed on the sternoclavicular joint because they don't attach to the clavicle, right? And then, so basically her argument was the lats can't move the sternoclavicular joint because there's no direct attachment. At certain points, she said it was an insignificant amount of torque. At other points, she said it was no torque, right? So just like a non-existent thing. At another point, she said it was like somewhere in between. So there's an inconsistency in that. But then there's also an inconsistency in the principle of like, okay, well, if the lats don't attach to the clavicle and they can't move the clavicle, then you also have to say that the pec minor can't move the clavicle because the pec minor doesn't attach to the clavicle, right? But one of her primary examples for like other depressors that could contribute, number one, she said pec minor, okay? So again, an inconsistency in principle there. And the other one was serratus anterior, which, as you mentioned in multiple of your posts, has an antagonistic function in the context of a pull down. But even if we said, okay, yeah, this one little part of the serratus, if it could, in some crazy hypothetical, if it could contract in isolation, it's still not directly attaching to the clavicle, it's attaching to the scapula. So there were multiple other of these kinds of things that were said, but this is, to your point, an example of like, if you don't understand any of the material, then someone saying serratus anterior, someone saying pec minor, it's like, oh, that's a muscle. Yes, that is a muscle. Yes, if I Google, oh my gosh, depression, right? But it's just taken out of context, much in the same way that all of the studies are taken out of context. For instance, multiple, different ones related to internal and external rotation. You guys went over all that, so I won't beat a dead horse, or at least you did. And then the last thing that I wanted to just make note of is like the sort of mention of using studies that were bad, even if I feel like that was the point at which everyone could at least like converge. It's like someone just blatantly saying, I use all studies, even if they're bad. But I think in terms of specifics and consistency, those are the things that I kind of wanted to point out about the conversation.
Yeah. I thought for sure when I brought up the external rotation study, that would be an indefensible position that we could converge on. And it was very surprising that the response was pretty much the opposite of that.
Yeah. Yeah. You knew from that point forward that it was doomed. It was doomed to fail.
I knew that there's nothing that I could say that was going to get her to move her position. And because she basically just repeated her same statement in response to that, I'm like, okay, there probably isn't anything that I can do to move it. And there definitely wasn't anything I could do from a biomechanics perspective, just based off of how the anatomy and biomechanics conversation went. I was like, okay, there's not enough knowledge on the other side for me to be able to provide the education in this context to get her position to change. This is something where, yeah, if I had weeks to walk you through these things, cool. But in the context of a debate, like, we're just never going to get on the same playing field. I'm curious, just as like a tangent here, what your favorite irrelevant muscle was that was brought up during this whole thing. I have mine, but I'm curious what yours was, because there were so many. There was sternocleidomastoid. Right?
No, man, no. For me, subclavius takes the cake for sure. I don't even think most people would know what subclavius is or where it is on the body, but I do think it's important to show the viewers what the subclavius muscle actually looks like. So apparently this muscle can move the shoulder girdle because it attaches directly to the clavicle, and it can also move the shoulder girdle more than the lats. So this was my favorite. Yeah, SCM was another one. I don't remember the others though.
One of my favorites was the right at the beginning of part 2. She got into the articularis genu.
Oh yeah,
it's a tiny little muscle that supports a bursa in your knee. And I'm like, we're talking about biasing the lats. Like, how do you rope the articularis genu into a conversation about biasing the lats? Yeah. So go ahead.
So did you have anything else to finish on that?
I was just going to say, so it's just very clear that there weren't a lot of bridges that I could create because they just couldn't traverse far enough between the gap between our understanding on these topics.
Yeah, for sure. So I want to kind of just finish up here by asking you a couple specific questions. What I'll start with is, number one, why is it that you wanted to do the debate? And then number two, with the understanding that you have in relation to how these things generally go, do you look back on it as something that you're like, I regret doing that or not? And if so, why? So the first question is, why did you want to do this in the first place? And then the second is more of a retrospective question of like looking back on it. Would you have, kind of a stupid question in some sense, but would you have done it if you knew exactly how it would play out? And if so, yes, no, why?
So the reason why I think mainly is just having wanting to have a role in keeping people on the right path. And she said so many things in her posts that were objectively not true or out of context in terms of the way she represented the research. And that's ultimately been like my biggest critique of her content is just, hey, you're flashing studies. A lot of times they don't represent the claim that you're making, even in cases where I actually agree with her premise. I'm like, yeah, but that study is not evidence of it, or that's not the right graph, or whatever it is. This just happened to be a case where I also disagreed with her on the premise. So I, I think that when we can very easily point out things with evidence, why wouldn't you take the opportunity to do this, especially knowing that basically so many people are going to see something that's called science-based, or there's a PubMed ID or a graph or whatever flashed up, and they're never going to look into it. Take the graph that was shown 4 or 5 times that's referencing a study on external rotation, and look at this, there's no clinical significantly difference between the lats. And I'm like, yeah, in an exercise that they would never be significantly involved in, period. But almost nobody is actually going to take the time and effort to understand that. They're just going to see this graph. And then, speaking about what we were early in the conversation about how people are just, they're taking external evidence and they're utilizing that. Well, you combine that with, man, this has sciencey stuff on it, or a fancy visual or a chart or whatever it is. So I'm going to take that with an even stronger degree of confidence. I think to me, that's really bad in terms of where we're going, because so many people are going to be led astray. Now, it's not catastrophic. We're not curing cancer here. We're talking about like upper, lower lats. But if you follow either of us, those are probably things that you care a little bit more about. There's probably a few people that follow me that care more about bigger biceps than they actually do cancer, but that's neither. It's neither.
Yeah.
So the main reason is that this just seemed like a very easy opportunity to address 2 things. One is just this type of content where like science is essentially being abused because you're not really getting any context of the study. You're getting a cherry-picked image or a quote with usually a very, very strong claim, and over and over and over again. And to me, this is like, it's not science. It's kind of brainwashing, if you will. And so I just thought this was an opportunity. Now, I wasn't like seeking a debate per se, but I'm also like, I'm not a person to turn down a debate. Now, given the difference in part 1 and part 2, I wouldn't have said no to part 2, but I think knowing what I know about how these things go and my expectations for what she was going to try and accomplish in part 2, I should not have accepted the format that was presented, because I just think it was an inevitable shit show. I don't think there was any way that we could have that type of a debate structure and it go well, because you can't have a person give a monologue and then another person, basically it's supposed to be even because they get 10 minutes and then you get 10 minutes. But the second person that goes, essentially you don't get a 10-minute opening statement. What you get is like, okay, now I'm having to respond to this. And if somebody talks for 2 or 3 minutes and then you can respond to them, cool. I don't have to remember that much. But, she was like speaking and reading as fast as she could for that 10-minute period and flashing slides. I'm trying to listen to her talk fast, so I'm not reading the slides. And when I read the slides afterwards, I'm like, oh my God, there's so many contradictions in here. I could do a whole video of her just using her slideshow, which I may actually do. But I think my ego in not wanting to say no, basically during this whole process, I just basically accepted everything that she wanted to do the whole time. And that includes for the first debate as well, because I wanted to post it. And one of her things is, oh no, we can't post this or whatever, now because she thinks that the second debate went well for whatever reason.
Yeah, gotcha, bro.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, this is really
Right.
the nail in the coffin.
Right.
Yeah.
Now it's like, oh, look, everybody go watch it. Just so funny. But I think I should have stuck to my guns, knowing that, hey, we can do as many of these discussions as we want, as long as we adhere to some rules of civility and objectivity, and use a format that actually allows us to address the things that the other person is talking about in a way that not only we can follow, but the audience can also follow as well. So throughout this whole process, I never once got to go through my evidence. And when I did, I had to do it in long chunks that were still broken up, what would have been much better, it would be to have been to do it in the format that I went through Ella's video, which is here's one study, here's what they found, here's the methodology and what I take away from it. How does this fit in your argument? And just go through that process. But I think the patience to do that, well, from the moderator was probably not there. And I think Ella, she requested this time thing because you can weaponize time in a debate very, very well. Basically, if you say a bunch of things that aren't necessarily true and you cover a whole broad things, you basically put your opponent at a huge disadvantage because it takes them longer to address all of those things. And so you have to choose like just a handful of those things. And so basically the scale is always just shifted whenever you have a huge long intro like that. Instead, the format should always be like, hey, we go through point by point. And if you want to give people a long section, it should be their concluding statements at the end, not necessarily a big, long opening monologue per se.
Yeah. Had you seen any of the YouTube debates where there are 20 people around someone who's in the center?
Mm-hmm.
The Jubilee. Okay. So first of all, I find that format very entertaining. It's not always productive. It's at minimum entertaining. But what I can extract from that is I do like how they have the person say a claim and then everyone gets their shot at whatever the specific claim is. So I do feel like if you and I were debating and someone said, ScientificSnitch won the debate, it's like we could just put that across the top and then we're required to like stay on like at least a somewhat narrow path where someone can easily course correct and identify, okay, when are we straying away from this specific claim? And then we go to the next one and the next one. And the goal of it would be like, okay, whoever is debating, person A and B would agree on a set of 5 claims or 10 claims or however many would be agreed upon. And then you could maybe go through bit by bit, like in that sort of a fashion. Or what we could do is we could have you just sit in a chair in the middle and then all of her fans can surround you 20-1. And that would be at least entertaining.
Yeah. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but because I haven't watched a ton of those, is there an element of that where like the other people get to raise a card or
I do not like that element of it because it's like typically the people who are, just to give one example, it would be like, 20 atheists surrounding a Christian or a Catholic or something. And whenever the Catholic or the Christian starts to like pick up steam in the argument, like actual points begin to be made, typically the atheists start to say, oh no, here's my flag. Like now we have to vote you out. So it's kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy of like the minute that the person who you disagree with starts to win the debate, you can just raise the flag. So in theory, it's like it would make sense, but just based on what I've observed, at least in those instances, it tends to be the case that when someone starts to actually say something interesting, people object.
So maybe if they had a balanced audience where it's 50% one side, 50% the other side kind of thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the round table is I think it's a bit of a long stretch, but I think the single claim at a time method could be good and fruitful.
It's especially for a technical conversation. We're talking about making opinions based off of scientific research, right? Which means that we have to be able to talk about that because anybody can just make a general claim of here's what I think of all of the research. And then you just spit your opinion and there's no context of why, or maybe you make some very generalizations of why. You'd be like, oh, I don't see statistical significance or consistency across this. And I'm like, well, wait a second. If we don't actually look at these things on individual levels, we don't know whether that's actually an accurate assessment or not, whether there's consistency or significance, etc. So I don't think that you can have these conversations, which are relatively technical, in any format other than going point by point, or it's just chaos. And what you'll have is you'll have people generalize to opposing arguments that basically fit their side, or sometimes, which is even more boring, is you will have people generalize to the point where they have no point of disagreement because they've just generalized all of the nuance out of it. And that's the most annoying debate because you don't even get the drama. You're just like, okay, I want to know what these two people think. And at the end of it, yeah, they both think that you should train hard and eat enough protein. I'm like, gee, thanks. That's what I wanted to listen to this hour long. conversation for, was to basically just watch these people work to 2 points of irrelevancy.
Yeah. Yeah. I just do want to point out the one point in the debate, again, I think it was the first one, where she said something like, I don't know why this even matters. Like, we're just going to do pull downs and rows. And the first thing I was thinking was like, was she not the one who originally like made the piece of content that was like, you cannot bias the upper lower lats?
Yes, she was. And her thing was, she even said, what know what the point is, we're just going to pull down the frontal and sagittal plane. So she was completely oblivious to what my point was, even
Yeah.
after we had talked for an hour and a half.
Yeah. 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 Bad sign. I also think like I was just in my head briefly imagining like what it would have been like to go through claim by claim, specifically on the point of like, do they even do the lats act on the sternoclavicular joint? Because one of the things that you brought up was like, okay, let's imagine that like they act less than you think that they do. Like, would the 4 to 5 times distance shrink down to less than the glenohumeral? Because if so, then we need to be having a very different discussion. And if not, then my point is still valid. Like, there's no escaping that box if the format is, okay, do the lats act in this joint? It's like we can't move on to irrelevant study after irrelevant study.
Yeah, let's imagine that I thought that she would have been capable of walking through the force coupling and reaction forces and going through that. Now, we don't have data on those things, right? I can't say this is how much the supraspinatus is going to be contributing here, et cetera. And that's why we're kind of estimating on a model of how things work. If we're just talking about this stuff or illustrating it, we need an actual computation model to measure these things, because you're talking about measuring hundreds of calculations simultaneously at every moment and joint angle, right? Like nobody is doing that by hand, right? It's taking you the whole year, and then I don't know, maybe you'd be through like half the range of motion or something. So point by point, if we could have gone through there, then yes, I could have said, okay, how do you think, based off of the force couples that are created going from the humerus to the scapula, and we would talk about like, okay, well, the lats downward rotation pull, and then that's going to force couple with the lower trap, et cetera. And how are we getting to where we're losing all of this force on our way to the clavicular joint? But I would say more importantly, if you really understood the topic isn't how much torque we're creating at the sternoclavicular joint. The topic is actually what's happening at the humerus and that action. It just happens to be that the axis for this, right, as it gets to the torso, this is the base axis, right? This is where all the motion that's happening during this ends at the sternum. So basically, yeah, we have tons of stuff moving between here and the handle that you're grabbing onto, to whether it's a row, it's a pull down, or whatever. But this is where it stops. So ultimately, what we're concerned about is what the lats are doing on everything in between there. And it's pointless to focus on what's happening right here, because how much force there is on the acromioclavicular versus the sternoclavicular, et cetera, isn't necessarily answering the question of, but how is the force from the lower lats versus the upper lats differently affecting the system? Because that system is going to kind of function similarly regardless of whether it's the upper or the lower lats pulling down, a little bit different, but because their force vectors are different. But we don't have to solve for all of those little things to understand that the lower lats and the upper lats pull in different directions.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
How do you think, just as another point of curiosity, how do you think this circle would be squared if the conversation were about chest? Like, for instance, if you were like, imagine you had a conversation about, oh, and this was another thing I forgot to mention, was the point about the upper pecs acting directly on the clavicle. That, I don't know if we want to get into that, but just very briefly for everyone listening, like, you can think about the upper pecs as kind of like another delt. Like, they don't do the sliding thing, but the middle and the lower pecs, they have an anchor point that is not on the shoulder girdle, so they can pull the whole shoulder girdle forward. And one of the points that was made was basically like the equivalent of saying, what's a good analog for this? Well, it would basically just be like saying that the front delt would have the ability to protract the scapula, Whereas saying that for the middle and the lower pecs would the opposite would be true, right? They do have an ability to move the upper arm and the entire shoulder girdle, much like the lats do. So how do you think that the conversation would have gone differently, like if this were on the front side of the rib cage?
Well, the differentiation is a little bit easier to see on the pecs simply because the pecs are closer to the joint, whereas the lats are all kind of like further away and down. The relative difference between the pecs and the lats isn't the same, and we get into positions where with the pecs we can get into a position where say literally flip their role, right? So they're shoulder flexors to a point, and then they become shoulder extensors once you get past a certain degree of flexion. So like your lower pecs can help you do a pullover, but they also help you do a press.
So you're saying let's just say isolate one part of the conversation. The lower pecs, they can pull the arm as an extensor in a certain way, so pullover type action. But in a press, they can also contribute. So they can create two opposing joint actions.
They do both flexion and extension depending on where the arm is.
Yeah.
Right. And so that creates a scenario where it's a little bit easier to see how these things are differentiating. But there's also scenarios where, for instance, if we're doing adduction from a wide position, they all are going to contract somewhat similarly because they essentially have the same relative function, and they can also force couple with each other. Like my upper and lower pecs, even though they don't pull directly towards my sternum, they oppose each other similarly so they can stay active as I pull towards the middle of my sternum. So
could you draw an analogy to theirs to something like, it's a little bit different, but something like lower traps and upper traps and retraction?
Yes, the upper traps would be elevating if the lower traps are also pulling down. They can't do that as well in isolation because of the rotational component, that you still need the rhomboid in there to manage the scapular rotation. But in a way, yes, you can retract your shoulder blades straight back. You can retract them up. You can retract them down. And you can retract them with upward rotation, downward, and all that good stuff. We don't have that much flexibility on the front, but essentially just the way I think of it is your muscle creates like a little bit of a drawbridge where the two ends are helping support the middle, if you will. So if we're aiming for the middle of your pecs, the bottom and the top are both assisting, but their indirect pull offsets. They cancel each other out, right? So if you've a simple way to do this is if you have ever been like, if you're pulling on a rope and somebody else is pulling on the other end, right? Okay, you guys are both pulling in the exact opposite direction. If somebody comes and grabs that middle one from the side and pulls out, then you guys will both be pulling against that person, but you'll still be pulling against each other a little bit, right? But basically the two of you should still win against your friend that came and grabbed the rope in the middle.
Yeah.
This is essentially how a lot of things in physics works. Is like, oh, we find a way so that basically we can get two indirect things to support a force in a direction that they don't support.
But it would still be the case in, say, a wider converging press that the sternal portion would be the thing that would do the most amount of work throughout, say, the course of a set.
Yes, the challenge is it's more, but are we measuring in a way where we can see more? So for instance, if we're measuring on EMG, like the difference is going to be small. But if we also account for, it's also going to go through more range of motion. It's going to be slightly preferentiated. It's maybe going to get a little bit more of a direct stretch. If we start adding all these little things together, that's where it makes sense, if I want to focus this, that I do actually apply that degree of specificity to it. But when we're using limited tools, if you only focus on one, it can seem like the difference is fairly insignificant. And that's one of the challenges with the lat discussion is there is more relative research on pressing angles and stuff like that for the chest. And so we do have examples where it's a little bit easier to differentiate. Like it is easier to separate probably a position where you could work very little lower pec relative to the upper pec to a more drastic degree than you could separate the upper and lower lats, right? You know, for example, I could do a motion like this that would still work the upper pec and none of the lower pec, or these shoulder flexion things or whatever. It doesn't make them the best upper pec exercise, but these are ways that I can essentially extremely limit the lower pec. So they are more, you can bias the upper pec from the lower pec to a greater degree in specific situations than you can the lats. And the biggest thing that has to do with just the way the muscle is orientated through the joint. If the lat was up where your traps are, then we would see basically we would have a similar effect. Or if your arm could go all the way back behind you, we would see basically more similar characteristics between the two.
Mm, okay. So overall, you thought the discussion would probably be a bit easier to differentiate. And what would be interesting too would be to see like how much of that context and principle could carry over then to the next
Yeah.
discussion.
Yeah, well, I don't think much because like I think she used the pecs as an example, and one of her anatomical reasons was because they cross the sternoclavicular joint. And I'm like, okay, but the lats don't, so therefore that's not fair. That's where she brought up the clavicular pec. Like what would have been a more important argument is not that the pecs cross the sternoclavicular joint. It would have been that there's one part of them that doesn't, if
Right.
that makes sense, right? But you have the same thing in the lats where we could probably get close to similar bias in the lats versus the pecs if we did something that was very biased towards loading the pelvis, right? So basically, like if I did a hang where I had a load on like one foot and I did like this kind of yeah, I bet I could get like no activation or whatever, but I'm not putting that exercise out there. Somebody will do it now because we
No,
talked.
you got to claim it as the original
Yeah.
before people hop on.
Yeah, I'll call them like Newton lateral bends because that's what everybody calls everything these days.
Yeah, I mean, just as long as you understand the three laws,
Yeah.
So I felt like I was going to say, I was going to
I
inform
feel
you.
like the Newton's third law thing that she keeps saying is ironic because I feel like she needs to apply that to the other aspects of her life.
Wow. Okay. All right. All right. I'm going to stay off. I'm going to stay away from that commentary for now. However, what I would want to add is just a final point, although I keep saying final point and we keep having more discussion, which I think is good. I think this will be valuable for people. Just to find crossing of a joint, because I think people are still maybe confused about that. People think, for example, that like the long head of biceps crosses the shoulder because of how snake-like it is, up into the glenoid, but the short head doesn't because for whatever reason it looks mysteriously bridged over.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it would be sensible to say that if a muscle crosses a joint, that it can create rotation about that joint. Does that seem like a fair, simple definition?
Well, you have to be a little bit more specific than that, right? So anatomical crossing means literally the muscle goes over the joint, but functional crossing means that it can act on that joint, but it can do without any external factors, right? So there's a lot of ways that a muscle can lead to movements at joints that are very distant or very far away, as long as there's external factors involved that basically constrain motion or something. Like the example I give is that, hey, your glutes can extend the knee if your foot is fixed, and your quads can extend your hip if your foot is fixed. But we don't call the quads hip extensors or the glutes knee extensors. They don't cross those joints functionally because they couldn't do that. If you were floating in space, and we also eliminated inertia because we'd have to do that too, and you just contracted your glute, you wouldn't flex your knee angle would stay the same. But if your foot is fixed, then it does. So when we're talking about like a functional crossing, that means that if that muscle contracts, it can act on that joint without any external factors. And the reality is it's always going to be producing force across those joints if it contracts. And what stops us from moving at all of those joints and actually being able to control how we move is we have other muscles that are either helping at certain joints or limiting motion at certain joints.
So one example that came to mind in terms of the, you called it functional crossing, but an example that is like the glutes performing knee extension this is not really in this more niche circle of ours, but like this is where the claim that the soleus extends the hip also comes from, right? In the context of the leg press, because people make the argument that like it's a plantar flexor, so it can push the knee down. If the knee goes down, then the hip is extended. Mm-hmm. So like that to me is kind of along a similar thread, but it's in the context of a leg press, that wouldn't really make sense to say that like, the soleus is a hip extensor in terms of the outcome that we would actually be seeing from that exercise.
Yeah. Well, you have to consider the way it changes things. So if the soleus is driving basically the tibial motion, right, that leads to knee extension, hip extension, that would basically force us to be plantar flexing into the foot plate,
Mhm.
right? So if you've done a leg press and you notice that you're not pushing up on your toes while you're doing it, you're not contracting, because you could probably, most people can calf raise what they're leg pressing,
Mhm.
right? So the threshold in which you're using the soleus in that exercise is significantly lower. And you can tell that simply by the pressure on the foot. And you could offset it by simply trying to drive through your heels or whatever, or you could accentuate it by trying to push through your toes.
Right.
And I think that comes from a paper that was done on squatting mechanics. Can the soleus help you out? And they used one of these models and they looked at the forces and they saw this huge spike at this position of, oh, the soleus force should be doing that. And I'm like, but did they account for how the foot pressure would have been? And in the model they used, because you have to validate these things by measuring force and activation. It's like, did they have a model where it actually accounted for foot pressure? Because if you
Mhm.
didn't have that spike in foot pressure on the forefoot, then you would know that there was significantly less soleus contribution in that action, which they're probably, like, I think that look at it probably was exaggerating the amount of soleus contribution that you can get in a squat.
Mhm. 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 Okay, so let's make this really simple for people then. A muscle, in order to cross a joint, let's just say from a gym perspective, right? Because now we're dealing with an external load that's pulling us. How many structural anchors do we have around us, right? It would make sense to me just to say in the context of training that you would not only need to understand the muscle in terms of like, okay, what bones is it attached to and how does it move these bones? If Cass is floating around in space and this muscle contracts, what happens? That's one important thing to know. But then it's also important to know, well, how is the resistance and the external scenario relating to that thing in isolation? Right.
Yep.
And you kind of have to combine those two worlds to have an actual practical picture.
So an easy way to think about this in the gym is if the former is true, it's going to remain true in the gym setting. If a muscle functions when you're floating in space, it's still going to function in those motions in the gym. What you're not going to be account for if you don't know the other physics is what else is getting added, right?
Mhm.
So for instance, if you're doing a dumbbell press, you're limited on how much tricep you can use because basically you have to balance the dumbbell in a certain spot. When
Yeah,
you get
right. So
into a,
so if the triceps contracted too hard, we would go, went.
yep. But now you throw a fixed bar or a machine handle in there, and now all of a sudden you can be pushing in all sorts of different directions and using that force to help you move the load. And so that could be more triceps, it could be more delts, you could be having more of a relative flexion or something intent than you normally could, etc. The thing when we're looking at resistance exercises usually is just accounting for those extra things that are coming along, right? And making sure that those things aren't either, okay, they're going to become an issue with my exercise order, my workouts or whatever, because I'm training a muscle that I wasn't intending to train, and then I'm trying to do it again tomorrow or on the next exercise, etc. And that we're also just making sure that the thing that we went in is usually still the limiter, which is usually going to be the case, right? Just because you go from dumbbells to a barbell doesn't necessarily make the triceps the limiter in the exercise. We need a lot of things to come along. But if we'll say the rigidness of the machine combined with the resistance profile and the et cetera started making the triceps a much bigger part, that could lead to the point where maybe I'm actually hitting close to failure or experiencing a similar RPE, but I'm actually further away from that in my chest. And now it's more of just, this is the RPE or RAR for the motion.
Hmm.
Right.
Right. And just to draw a parallel, people could consider the triceps akin to the quads in the sense of like if you have your foot on a foot plate, you
Mm-hmm.
could consider the quads a hip extensor in the same way that you could consider the triceps a shoulder flexor or shoulder adductor.
Yep. And if you learn all the nerd stuff, you learn how to emphasize these things or de-emphasize these things to suit a goal. Because there's a lot of ways you can do it with intention, range of motion, manipulating resistance profile, etc.
Yeah. And I think to circle back and tie a nice little knot on this, I think that's why you see so many bodybuilders sort of training like in the way that they do. And I think that's another reason why and I've made this mistake plenty of times, why it's wrong to assume that like they're just doing it because bro science and steroids, right? It's like Jay Cutler's doing this like half rep press because he's like, well, this is just makes it like all pecs and like I don't get much else doing this. So just to assume that like fixed bar equals more triceps to your point earlier, I think specifically when we're watching people who obviously know what they're doing, at least on an experiential level, I think it's wrong to jump to those conclusions. And oftentimes when I have made the assumption that like, oh, that guy wrong because this one fact that I learned, it's usually because I'm missing 5 other things about the scenario.
Yep. Evolution in the space of biomechanics is that you just learn to consider more and more and more things, right?
Yeah.
To the point where now you don't look at anything simply, right?
Right. All right. So I feel like this has been pretty fruitful and I'm interested to see like what people's feedback on this. I feel like we could do more of these. I think we have a good sort of back and forth here, and this ended up somewhere that I did not expect. So I think that's probably a good thing, or I'm looking at it as a good thing. So if people are still listening at this point, drop a comment and be like, hey, do you want to see more of this? The Cass-Ben duo. And maybe we can pick a topic to do more of a debate style thing if we have any kind of point of profound disagreement on something.
I don't have to get in a fight every time before we do it, right?
No, I mean, I don't think so, but I mean, that would be maybe more useful for the viewers in some ways.
Yeah, I'll do my best.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you give us a like, subscribe, and leave us a review, and we will see you on the next episode of the N1 Experience.